At the same time that the coercive acts were passed, coercive meaning force, the force acts to force the colonials to do what Britain thinks they ought to do, force them to their duty. At the same time those acts are passed, Parliament also passes the Quebec Act. Now for the Quebec Act, we have to go back to our map from the French and Indian War. All this land was formerly property of New France. It was the French Empire. It's now property of England. The Quebec Act was an administrative tool organizing this land, specifically the North Canadian lands around Quebec and the Upper Great Lakes. In organizing these regions, it provided for them with a royal governor, but no appointed local colonial legislatures. It also allowed Catholicism to be the religion of these regions. That's because the French were Catholic in nature and the British were seeking to not antagonize the new colonial subjects they had. Remember the British priority, keeping the peace. They don't want Indians fighting colonists. They don't want colonists fighting French. They don't want the French fighting colonists or Indians. They're trying to keep for a stable social situation. The colonials view this in horror. First of all, the colonials were very anti-Catholic. Remember, they had Puritans who'd come to New England, wanted to purify the Anglican Church because they said it was still too Catholic. So they see this as being almost like a giant door that's being shut to prevent their religion from extending elsewhere, and a door that can close can swing further across and maybe apply to them and take away their religious liberties. Additionally, they see the lack of a the lack of a colonial legislature being a precedent that could be set in all the colonies, particularly with what's just happened to the coercive acts. So all this from the colonial mindset, the colonial worldview, starts to look more systematic and more sinister and more like it's actually not just a specific set of responses to a specific set of events, but part of an overall narrative, an undercurrent, an overall continuous narrative that's leading in one direction and one direction only, which is the permanent and final removal of colonial rights, turning them from subjects into slaves in their mindset and their worldview. So that brings us then to just before the break and just before violence, colonial philosophy. And I've hinted at some of this already. What was colonial political philosophy? Well, first of all, there's no unified one philosophy in the colonies. Even though they're writing in committees of correspondence, they're communicating and discussing things with one another, there's no one set narrative on what liberty is, what it means to be a British subject, what it means to defy Crown law. There's no one set political philosophy on that yet. But we are going to talk about this notion of ideology. It's another AP history word as we expand on this AP history word list. We're going to define an ideology as a body or a set of political ideas that's connected to a movement or to a philosophy. And the American Revolution has its own ideology, its own set of political ideas that's connected to it. And that set starts with this notion we talked about of a plot against liberty. The idea that the king and parliament are both being tyrannical and arbitrary. They're takers away of civil and economic rights. They're takers away of a fair government. And the British Empire is increasingly now seen as despotic, conspiratorial, rotten, corrupt. And in this, the colonials see themselves as the good actors. And they see increasingly they begin to equate the new world. Think about that term, new versus old. They start to see the new world as a new world, something that's fresh, vibrant, pure and fine, as opposed to the corrupting agents of the despotic, rotten, tyrannical old world of Europe. So we see ourselves as being non-decadent and non-corrupt. That's what the colonials see themselves as opposed to the decadence and corruption and absolutism of Europe in many ways. And if you want linkage, this takes us back to that whole concept of the Puritans and the city on the hill. The notion that America and Americans are unique and special in their own ways and have a special destiny, and that this new world has a new clean break. It's humanity's fresh start, and that maybe there might be a reason to sever these ties with the old world because the old world will drag us down into sin and corruption and failure and enslavement. Also in these ideas are the ideas of classical republicanism. This is not Republican like Republican Party, like capital R Republican Party. This is lowercase r republicanism, which is also an ideology. It's a set of political ideas that revolves around the idea of a nation almost like the Roman Republic, a nation of virtuous, civic-minded citizens in a virtuous land who put the collective good in some ways ahead of their own good, but who were not tyrannized for doing it. Every individual acting as their own moral agent as part of and considering the needs of the civil body politic as a whole. This starts to play into American revolutionary thinking as well. The rhetoric of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, and the rhetoric of Thomas Paine are also going to stir people up during this time in terms of explaining this in ways that are easy for the common folk to understand. But the last ideas of this revolutionary period are ideas, curiously enough, that come from the Old World. They come from Europe and come from the Enlightenment. They're the twin ideas of the philosophical thinkers of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. John Locke's idea of natural law was essentially a premise that absolute monarchs and kings are kind of wrong and incorrect to have that, because the universe is governed by natural law, and there's natural laws and natural rights that people have as human beings that their creator, that God gave them, that no man or king ought to be able to take away. You'll be hearing much more about language about that in about the next 2 or 3 lessons, because that's going to play very importantly and forcefully into a document you know as the Declaration of Independence. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another Enlightenment thinker, a Frenchman, articulated the idea of the social contract, which takes the position that governments and people strike bargains. People agree to consent of the governed. Governments rule because people give the government that power to rule, but only as long as that government acts in the interest of the people. If that government does not do what the people want or what the people need, Rousseau argued that people have the citizenry, they have every right to jettison that government, to throw it away, to throw it in the trash bin, and start from scratch with a new one that might better meet their needs. You couple together these revolutionary Republican ideals with this notion of the social contract, with the notion of natural rights given to us by God, and the notion of this plot against liberty that might be designed to take these rights away, and everything in this lesson and the lesson before this one start to really make sense towards seeing why British action fueled colonial paranoia. Whereas the British, for their parts, saw their actions as doing what you're going to do to try to run this gigantic world global empire enterprise, the colonials saw it as specifically targeted and designed to be only for exploiting and punishing and destroying them, the colonials, and their way of life. And it's this inability to turn this corner, to get around this idea of two groups talking past each other versus talking at each other, that's going to lead to the outbreak of direct outright violence in our next lesson, as we go from the road to revolution to the revolution itself. And that will be in our next lesson.